Hi everybody, EricTheCarGuy here with another in the series of electrical videos that I have for you. And this one is also brought to you by BBB Industries that remanufactures starters and alternators to meet or exceed manufacturer's specifications. Okay, this video we're going to talk about starter diagnosis. And in my experience, the first thing I want to check if I'm turning the key and the car is not turning over. Now it's important to make this distinction. Don't even consider the starter being a problem if you're turning the key and the engine cranks over. So if you turn the key and the engine turns, then it's not a starter issue. But if you're turning the key and nothing happens, or you just hear a click, or something along that nature, you might want to, you want to follow this procedure that I'm about to outline in this video. And the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about this is if you go to start the vehicle and the anti-theft system may be having a problem for one reason or another. Some vehicles are equipped with an anti-theft system that has a signal generator inside of the key and a receiver inside of the vehicle that says, okay, this is the key for this car, and then goes ahead and starts the vehicle. Some vehicles will crank but will not start. Some vehicles won't crank at all with the system on there. So I want you to keep in mind that it could be the anti-theft system that is not allowing the vehicle to start on some vehicles. So don't just jump to the conclusion that it's a starter issue. It could be just that. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, really, if you are having that issue, the only place to go is the dealer. They're the ones that have the tools and equipment to deal with it. I really don't know of any other way. So if you do have that problem and you see like maybe a flashing light on the dash that lets you know that that anti-theft system is active and not starting the vehicle, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to take it to the dealer, no matter what. So, good luck to you on that. But if you've determined that that is not the problem, and we're going to move on to the next step, well, this is what we do. Many starter problems, in my experience, actually start at the battery. So that's the first place I go if I'm having a no start condition, no start, no crank condition, is I go to the battery and do a few checks. And this is what I do. My first check is going to be battery voltage. I'm going to get my DVOM, which I have here, and I'm going to put it on the voltage setting, DC voltage, and I'm going to put it on 20 because battery or system voltage should not exceed 20 volts, but it's a good place to start. And the first thing I'm going to do is check the voltage. All right, that's a nice reading. 12.67 volts. That's about as perfect as you want to see. A minimum of 12.4 volts. So you don't want to see 12 volts. 12 volts wouldn't be enough. But seeing 12.67 like this is a real good start. So you want to see at least 12. Well, you want to see 12.6, but at the very least you want to see 12.4. Next check is going to be my load test, and I covered this test in another video that I did. On this test, when we activate the load, we don't want it to fall below 9 volts. That's really good. We're only dropping down to like, what, 11 and some change. And we'll do this a couple of times just to make sure we remove the surface charge from the battery. Still in the green, everybody's happy. Okay, so now we've done a load test on the battery itself. If you don't have access to one of these, you may be able to get access to this at your local reputable auto parts stores, because many times they have something like this laying around to test batteries that people bring in, that kind of thing. But this is basically how you use it. And you start by hooking the terminals up. Positive goes to positive, negative goes to negative, and then you'll see the display come up. And what it's asking for now is the CCA of the battery, and that's usually on the sticker on the top. This one happens to be have a CCA of 670, and CCA stands for cold cranking amps. So they bring this down to a temperature, I think it's actually freezing or something like that, and then they check the amp output of the battery, and this one is 670. So we're going to set up our tester to say 670. Okay, now that we've got our battery tester hooked up, it's going to ask us for the CCA. We already saw that this battery here has a CCA of 670, so we're going to hit our up arrow until we get to 670. There's 660. I'm actually we can go 660 or 680. We can't go 670. So I'm going to go with 660 in this case. And then all you have to do is press the test button, and then it starts working its magic. Beep, 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 beep. And we could see that this particular battery comes comes up in the red, which means it's not good, and it's only given us a CCA of 505, which is much less than the 670 that it's apparently rated for. It seems to be starting the vehicle fine, but one more push of this test button and it'll show us the available voltage, which in this case is 1266, which is a good available voltage, but it's not a good CCA. So I'm kind of disappointed to see that, but if the battery were low and maybe needed a charge, this one would be illuminated with this amber light, I believe. And if it was good and everything was okay, this upper green light would be illuminated. But since this red one's illuminated and this is much less than 670 CCA, really, this battery should be replaced. One other interesting feature about this tester is that if you, when you first hook it up, if you push this button, the V button for voltage, it'll give you the available voltage right off the bat without even testing the CCA. And as we've spoken about in the past, anything less than 12.6 is not acceptable, and the battery either needs to be charged or it's not necessarily up to par. Something really important to keep in mind, as long as we're here at the battery, is you definitely want to check your battery connections. So you want to check your terminals and make sure the terminal isn't loose. And you also want to make sure that there isn't a whole bunch of corrosion here. If there's a lot of corrosion here or this terminal is loose, it's very possible that this connection is not allowing the electricity to flow down to the starter. So your problem could just be right here at the battery. So make sure that your battery terminal connections are clean and tight. If they aren't, address those immediately before you really start doing any more testing. And this goes for the ground side. This is the positive battery cable here, but you also want to make sure that you check the ground cable because either one could be at issue. You know, as long as we're on the subject of cables and connections, you take a look at your cables. Make sure that they don't have any like big fat spots in them that might indicate that there's corrosion underneath the insulation. Look for spots where the insulation may have come off and maybe there's some corrosion down inside the wires, that kind of thing. Definitely look out for that kind of stuff because that does affect the flow of electricity to the starter. So make sure you check not only your connections but also your cables going down to the starter itself so that you don't see any problems there. Now you want to make sure that you're getting voltage down to your solenoid wire, and the easiest way I can think to do that is to take one lead, or a test light will also work for this, but it won't tell you exactly how much voltage is going down there. One lead and put it on battery negative, and then take the other lead and put it on the starter solenoid wire itself and turn the engine to the crank position. All right, Greg. And you should see battery voltage. One more time. And there you go. If you turn the ignition to start and you're on that solenoid lead and you do not see battery voltage or something close to it going down to it, there's a couple of things I want you to check. The first thing I want you to check is if your vehicle is equipped with a neutral safety switch, go and look to the neutral safety switch. A lot of different manufacturers handle those in a lot of different ways. So I want you to check the manufacturer's specifications for checking the neutral safety switch on your particular vehicle. The next thing, some vehicles use what's called a starter relay. So they have a relay that's in place that sends electricity down to the starter while you're cranking the engine. So if you do not have that battery voltage there at that terminal for the solenoid, it's quite possible that either the starter relay or the neutral safety switch is at fault. It could also be a problem with the ignition switch itself. So you've got some things to check if you don't have that voltage there. But keep in mind, if you don't have battery voltage, when you turn the engine to the start position, when you are doing that particular test, the starter's not the issue. The starter's not getting a signal to start. So if you don't have that battery voltage there, don't replace the starter because that's not your problem. Your problem is actually elsewhere. Check your neutral safety switch and check your starter relay if you have one. Another thing you want to watch, or another way to check, I told you to check to see if these terminals make sure that they were clean, but something that you can do is called a voltage drop test. Now this would be a really good test, like say if you've got one of those starters that's located up underneath an intake manifold and you can't necessarily get to it, get to especially the positive side or anything to do any kind of testing down there. What you can do is you can do a cranking voltage drop test to see if it's within specifications. And for that, you can do one on the positive battery terminal and you can do one on the negative battery terminal. And quite simply, all you do is and these are cranking tests. So you first First thing you want to do is you want to disable your ignition system. Either unplug whatever needs to be plugged into your ignition coil, something along those lines. Just find some way to disable the ignition system, or you can also take your foot and put it to the floor on the gas, and that will disable the fuel injectors from putting fuel into the cylinders. But for this test, you need to crank the engine. So anyway, get yourself set up, disable your ignition system or what have you, and then you can take your terminals on your DVOM and put one terminal. This is for the positive side. You want to take one lead and put it on the positive battery post, and you want to take the other lead and you want to put it on the starter positive going into there, and then crank the engine, or try to crank the engine. If the starter's not cranking, obviously you probably wouldn't be doing these tests. But you're going to take the other lead and we're going to put that right on where the positive cable goes onto the starter. Then we're going to crank the engine. The positive side cranking test, you don't want to see any more than 0.7 volts here. So if you see more than 0.7 volts here, then that's too much of voltage drop, and there may be an issue with the cabling or connections going down to the starter. With the negative side, you put one lead on the negative terminal and you put the other lead. This is good for those times when they're stuffed up underneath the intake. If you can get, sometimes these meters come with long leads, and you can stick this down through to where you can touch the case of the starter. So put one lead on battery negative and the other lead on the outer case of the starter and crank the engine. Now for that one, you don't want to see more than 0.25 volts. So if you see more than 0.25 volts, you know there's too much resistance in the cabling and connections going down to the starter. Okay, last but certainly not least in all of this, if you're just getting like a thud, click, whatever when you're turning the key and the engine is not turning over, get yourself a ratchet, get onto the crankshaft, whatever size fastener it is, and see if you can rotate the engine by hand. If you cannot rotate the engine by hand, then the starter can't rotate it either, and there's probably a mechanical failure inside the engine itself. I've seen this happen before, like the engine comes apart or whatever, it's got broken internal parts and they're all jammed up against the inside of the block, and the crankshaft cannot rotate for nobody's business. It is mechanically smashed in there. The starter can't turn that over either. So you want to make sure that the engine can rotate, because if the engine can't rotate, then the starter can't do anything. But still, the starter is not your problem. It's actually problem with the engine, and you're probably going to have to replace it. So make sure that the engine can spin. Alright, you've gone through all these checks and you know for sure you got a bad starter. Well, something to note on some vehicles that use shims on the starter assembly. Sometimes you'll get a starter assembly and it will come with like these long shims that go over the top of the starter. Don't lose them when you take them off. So if you take this thing off and you got a couple of pieces of metal that come off with this, you want to make sure you put those same pieces back into where they're supposed to be. Because what that does is it allows the starter to line up with the flywheel. Now if that's not lined up properly, and you take a look and you see these teeth that are down inside here, and you see these teeth have abnormal wear on them, then that could mean that the starter is not properly aligned. It could be like a little bit up or a little bit down, that makes it so that every time that this, it's called a Bendix, every time this Bendix or one-way clutch or whatever comes out, it's not making good contact with the flywheel itself. And that's usually corrected by these shims to either, reposition this starter in such a way to where it makes good contact. One more word about this Bendix here, and that is sometimes a starter problem is not an electrical problem. Sometimes it does start the vehicle, but you get a lot of noise. Well, that goes back to maybe it's not shimmed up correctly and maybe it's not making good contact with the flywheel. But the other thing it could be is that this one-way roller clutch stays engaged and doesn't pop back into the assembly like it's supposed to. So every time you turn the key, it's supposed to throw this out and make contact with the flywheel and then go back in when it's done. Well, if not, and it stays in here, after you're done turning the key, you may hear it running, like whee, another sound after the fact. That could be a mechanical failure of the starter. So keep those things in mind also, as far as when you're talking about replacing starters. Okay, purpose of this video, you've got tools. Use them. In using them, you'll make it so you don't have to go back to the parts store and tell them you got a bad starter when maybe you don't. That's what I'm trying to help you out with here. Just take a little bit of time, And in fact, the diagnosis and the tests that I showed you, if you actually do them, will take less time than it took to watch this video. At the very least, check the voltage at where the solenoid comes down, because that'll rule out the neutral safety switch or that starter relay. Just take the time to do that. If nothing else, just make sure you got 12 volts here when you turn the key to crank, because if you don't have 12 volts here when you turn the key to crank, then the problem is not the starter. The problem is before here, because remember, without this voltage here coming in, causing this starter to work, it's not going to spin anything, and that's it. So, not the starter, no 12 volts here, no battery voltage here. Let's say battery voltage. Anyway, I'm Eric the Car Guy. You can always visit me at EricTheCarGuy.com or follow me on Facebook and Twitter. And we want to thank our friends at BBB Industries for helping to bring this video to you today. BBB Industries remanufactures alternators and starters to meet or exceed OE specifications. Isn't that special? Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. See ya.